Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. It's co-presented today by BLiNQ Networks and Federated Wireless. As you know, the topic today is what is next for CBRS. My name is Mary. I'm the Marketing Director at BLiNQ, and our presenters today are Kurt Schaubach, CTO from Federated, and Juan Matos, Tech Support Lead from the BLiNQ side. Just to go over our agenda briefly, Kurt will open with a CBRS overview, and he'll take you through the deployments around the PALs and the GAA. The second half of the webinar will be Juan talking a bit about BLiNQ's hardware. Then he'll do a demonstration on how to connect a CBSD to the SAS. We will take most of your questions at the end, but feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation, as we have an extended team who may be able to address some of your questions. So without delaying further, I will hand it over to Kurt, and he'll kick us off with the CBRS overview.
Great, and thanks so much, Mary. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today, and particularly I'd like to thank the BLiNQ Networks team as early innovators and collaborators with Federated in the CBRS space. It's wonderful to be able to talk about what the latest and greatest is in CBRS with you all today. So again, what I'm going to do is for the next 20 minutes or so is talk a little bit about the background on CBRS, give you a sense of how the spectrum sharing framework works, talk a little bit about the architecture. But I really hope in this presentation, what you take away is understanding the key benefits of how CBRS can maybe be applied in your business, maybe satisfy a particular use case that you have not been able to satisfy, through other means to date. So next slide, please, Mary. So what's really unique about the CBRS band and shared spectrum generally is that it creates a new way of spectrum access. Many of you who operate private networks or have networks that you use for your own enterprise, or even if you're a service provider, maybe in a competitive space, you understand that acquiring licensed spectrum has traditionally been a very difficult proposition. It's costly, and it's a very competitive marketplace when you're trying to go up against large mobile network operators to acquire spectrum. Alternatively, unlicensed spectrum has been a great way to satisfy your needs to deploy a network. But the challenge with unlicensed spectrum often is that the access is unpredictable. The quality of spectrum that you get is not deterministic. It could result in coverage or capacity issues. So that isn't really an ideal solution either. With the CBRS band, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, this is 150 megahertz of spectrum that is really beachfront property and is ideally suited to deliver on both the needs of enabling faster and cheaper service, providing deterministic access to spectrum, and also being able to tap into a massive 4G and 5G equipment ecosystem. So we've already seen in the year that this has been in commercial operation, all sorts of exciting new use cases being put to use, and we hope that this might be an outstanding opportunity for all of you as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of where we stand, as I said, we've been now in commercial service for just over a year. That started back in January of 2020. And since that time, we've actually, as an industry, been able to get to over 100,000 small cells or access points deployed in the band. And that's actually a really substantial accomplishment because oftentimes when, say, for example, mobile network operators seek to deploy small cells, getting a few thousand small cells deployed in a year is a big achievement. So the fact that, generally the industry overall has been able to get to, 100,000 plus within just over 12 months really speaks to how this new band and the diversity of use cases that it supports, the fact that it creates access for all sorts of different users is really, achieving the goal of, creating a new way to access spectrum and deploy networks. To date, a little bit over half of the entire deployment is on the Federated Wireless Spectrum platform, spectrum management platform, what we call a spectrum controller. And I'll talk more about what those functions are, but it comprises the spectrum access system and environmental sensing capability. What we've seen early on in the market and in adoption is that fixed wireless has really come on strong. It's been a very strong leader in terms of early deployments. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the ecosystem related to fixed wireless, whether it's the base stations or the end user devices, it's what I would call a little bit more of a closed ecosystem. Operators can control the pace at which they deploy their base stations, do customer installs. And that degree of control has allowed them to move maybe a little bit faster than, say, other service providers who need to rely on penetration of end user devices like smartphones and tablets and other capabilities to take advantage of CBRS. The other aspect is, we are in a very unique time with the global pandemic and the challenges that has presented, where broadband access has become even more critical. So we've seen lots of fixed wireless providers investing in their network, expanding their network capabilities to meet the demands of their customers, where maybe people are working from home or they have children who are receiving school at home, and they need a really high quality broadband connection that CBRS can help deliver. Another major milestone for the industry has been the priority access license. And I'll talk more about how these tiers of sharing and access work in the CBRS band, but this was an important milestone because it put into effect put into place the last brick of what was needed for the foundation of the band. Now that this auction is complete, basically all of the the regulatory activity is complete as well, and we can continue forward with even more commercial growth as we head further into 2021. Next slide, please. So as I said, the priority access license auction concluded last year. This was a really important proof point for CBRS because companies had to, pay money. They had to, commit money in an auction to gain access to these prioritized licenses in the band. And, the auction, I think, was a huge success. And, I think analysts and others would certainly agree with that assessment. A success from the standpoint of not only did it, net a substantial, aggregate proceeds for the auction, licenses, the license auction overall, but because of the number of licenses that were auctioned, the diversity of auction applicants and auction winners, I think you can just clearly see from this list, it includes MNOs, cable operators, utilities, even real estate companies that acquired this spectrum in order to provide new innovative services over the band. So really, I think a very exciting outcome. And what this also paves the way for is something called secondary markets, the ability to lease priority access licenses or license rights from these primary licensees in areas where maybe you're a small enterprise, you're a small company, you have some need for a priority access license, but you didn't need the whole license. This now is a way through these secondary market transactions where licensees could lease the spectrum to other entities, I think creating even more innovative uses of the CBRS band going forward. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of just how large the equipment ecosystem is, this is often measured in terms of end user devices. Today we have a number of equipment suppliers that are building the infrastructure. Of course, BLiNQ networks being key among those, but also end user devices. Cover the complete range of smartphones. If I had time, I'd go through other slides that show, CPE devices that can be used for fixed wireless, modules that can be used for IoT. So this is really, a tremendous ecosystem that service providers, that private wireless network deployers can tap into. And what's really important about ecosystems is ultimately how that translates to value for the deployers and for the end users of the band. In this case, what it means is there's diversity of choice for those who are going to deploy and operate a network. We've got lots of options to choose among. Also, end user devices means that there's a variety of different use cases that can be supported. Next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about how the band works, the fact that it's 150 megahertz of spectrum in midband. Just to give you a sense of proportion, 150 megahertz, if you were to take away, say, the millimeter wave assets that Verizon or AT&T own, 150 megahertz is about the same amount of spectrum that they have in any market that they use to support, 100 million subscribers. So this is a tremendous amount of spectrum. Midband spectrum means that it provides a real nice balance between coverage and capacity, allowing you to use it for outdoor deployments, but also in building environments equally well. And, the amount of spectrum means that you can also get fairly large bandwidths, 20, 30, 40 megahertz, which allows you to deliver, very meaningful throughput to end users. The sharing occurs on two tiers of access. There are, of course, incumbents. The good news is those incumbents, while they're allocated to operate over a fairly large portion of the band, what they actually use based on the amount of spectrum, the geography, the time, is actually quite limited. So there's a tremendous amount of excess capacity or unused capacity that the incumbents are not occupying, which we're able to make available on these, two tiers of access. The priority access licenses, so this is a tier of access that, as I indicated, the FCC just concluded an auction for this spectrum. These are 10 megahertz licenses. There's up to 7 that the FCC has auctioned and issued within a given county. And these licenses give users sort of a prioritized access over the lower tier of access, or general authorized access tier. And what that's valuable for is that for certain use cases that really require a guarantee of, say, a minimum amount of throughput or a minimum bandwidth to meet your business case, these priority access licenses allow you to do that. The licenses are unique because they don't attach or aren't associated with a specific frequency assignment. They're instead managed by our software platform, our spectrum access system. But what we do is we find and allocate a 10 megahertz channel. If there's an incumbent that needs to be protected, we reallocate that user somewhere else within the 100 megahertz that's permitted for PAL use, so that we can always guarantee that a priority access licensee has access to high quality spectrum and that incumbents are protected. The second tier of access, the general authorized access tier, doesn't require a license to use it. It is more like unlicensed spectrum in that sense, where you just simply need equipment and you need connection to our spectrum access system to receive a spectrum grant and operate in the band. But the unique aspect about this is that since our platform manages the spectrum access, and since we have knowledge of where every user is in the band, based on the registrations that they do with our system, we're able to provide a very clean spectrum assignment. So while users don't have a guarantee of spectrum, the amount of spectrum that they want in every location, in some cases they might receive a grant for less spectrum than they'd like to receive, but we'll always satisfy those requests. The good news is that when they do get a request, the spectrum that we're able to allocate to them will be truly, high quality, deterministic access, and interference free. Next slide, please. So some of you have been operating in a portion of the band, and you probably saw in the last slide what was called grandfathered wireless broadband licensees. You've been operating under some old rules with the FCC. When the FCC created the CBRS band, they opted to merge this band known as Part 90 together with the new CBRS band, and operators of the old under the old license regime with the the older technology had to complete in large part had to complete a migration at the end of 2020. There are still some licensees who either received an extension or had their license extended all the way through 2023 that need to still complete this transition. If you happen to fall in one of those two categories, please feel free to reach out to us. We can help you with your migration needs. But quite frankly, anyone who's looking at providing a wireless ISP service, the resources that we offer on our website can be really valuable for you to think about how CBRS works, how it can be applied in fixed wireless, and how to potentially take best advantage of the capabilities of CBRS for your business. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's two key components to the how spectrum sharing is effectuated, how we provide protection to the federal incumbents. One platform is the software platform where devices register, they get authenticated, they receive spectrum grants, and we provide the ongoing spectrum management through a very simple software interface or API. That technology is called the Spectrum Access System. What works together with the Spectrum Access System is something called the environmental sensing capability. And this is a network of sensors that is used to identify when a particular incumbent, in this case, the US Navy, activates radars, Navy radars that are operated out at sea, and for the most part, some land-based locations, but mostly at sea. And these radars, when they activate, since they can move around, since they turn on and off, we needed to develop a technology that allowed us to identify when they were using the spectrum and where they were using it, so we could take the appropriate actions to provide protection. And that's what this network of sensors or environmental sensing capability achieves. We really have been the market leader in the environmental sensing capability area. We deployed and operationalized our network way back in 2019, even before the band launched, in large part so that we could begin to do the work of optimizing and perfecting the technology out in the field. Today, we've done lots of hardening of the network, and we really take an approach as a provider of a service to telcos and other entities who are providing critical broadband services to their end users. We really take a telco mentality in terms of how we operate this network, where it's 5 nines availability, where we harden it and provide redundancy to make sure that we can withstand all sorts of weather events or other natural events that might otherwise cause network outages. We take the same approach with our Spectrum Access System. We have all sorts of redundancy built into our cloud platform that ensures that we have high availability to meet your needs and meet your customer needs. Next slide, please. So CPI is a unique aspect of the CBRS band, Certified Professional Installer. In order for the Spectrum Access System to provide accurate spectrum assignments and assure that we're providing protection to incumbents, devices need to be professionally installed so that we can get that accurate information inputted into the Spectrum Access System. So the industry created a Certified Professional Installer program. It's an 8-hour online course that we can, that we provide through the link there. We are running a special, as we note here, for those who want to go through training. But this is required for people who are managing the network or who are interacting with our Spectrum Access System, or who interact with the BLiNQ network management platform. And what you do is you provide through a software key that you're issued after you complete the training course, you certify and attest that the installation record, the physical coordinates, the height, other specific parameters that are needed to accurately model the installation in our software are provided according to industry standard, so that we can assure consistent use of the spectrum and consistent protection of incumbents. Next slide, please. So another service that we're offering to customers, and this is something that we just newly launched, for those of you who are doing fixed wireless, one challenge always is to make sure that before you roll a truck and do an install, that you will be able to serve a customer at the required signal level to achieve the data throughput or performance that you want to provide that customer. And what we are providing, along with our other tools and capabilities, is a fixed wireless service planner. So this is a tool that you can go online through very accurate 3D modeling and RF simulation. You can analyze whether you'll meet the coverage objective at a particular customer location before you do a truck roll to make sure that once you do get on site that you're going to be able to get a very high quality install. So very simple, easy to use, intuitive, platform. We've already, received great feedback from customers who are using this as part of their fixed wireless deployments. Next slide, please. So in terms of the PAL, I talked about, the fact that the FCC concluded the license auction. They're going through the final steps of issuing the final licenses to the auction winners. There's also been some industry events that have been occurring to get ready for the commercialization of PAL, to go about assigning which channels will be associated with, nominally associated with which users by each of the SASs, so that we can, ensure an orderly transition over to PAL and full commercial use in the mid-April timeframe. Next slide, please. So the way we do protection in the SAS, so this is all things that are, again, fully automated, that have been tested and certified by the FCC prior to the commercial launch of the band. But basically what happens is if you are a PAL licensee and say you're already deployed, or say that you're about to deploy, you will have specific credentials associated with your install, your installation record, as I described earlier, that CPI record that's created. And those credentials will also include information that you are a priority access licensee in a given area. And then what happens is when you go through the process of registering with the Spectrum Access System, we will be able to verify through the FCC databases and through other industry databases that you're the PAL licensee in the area. Based on that, we will create a protection contour around your priority access license deployment. And we do that either for individual base stations or for groupings of base stations. We'll provide a single contour around a group of base stations. And then we provide ongoing protection. So the good news is if you're already deployed and you're converting your deployment from GAA to PAL, this is very easy, seamless. This is something that the folks at BLiNQ and Federated can work with you on to make sure that once we do go live, you'll be able to take full advantage of your PAL spectrum. Next slide, please. So in terms of GAA and what happens with GAA after the PAL licenses go into effect, say in a given market, 7 PALs are issued, they're in use. That means 80 megahertz of spectrum is still reserved for GAA, plus any unused PAL. So PALs are valid based on their actual deployment, that protection contour that I described. So any areas within the county license area that are unused also become GAA. So if you're a GAA user, good news, there's still plenty of spectrum for you to take advantage of. If you're a PAL user, you can begin using your PAL, and you can even request additional spectrum through GAA. So you're allowed to combine or aggregate both PAL and GAA spectrum together. And another key thing that is in the process of being rolled out that we've been doing on a sort of manual basis today, offline, and we will be offering an automated capability of over the course of this year, is coexistence. And what coexistence is the way that the SAS platform manages spectrum assignments to make sure that everyone gets as clean and interference-free a spectrum assignment as possible. This is where we do the simulations of all the different networks and sites that are in place and figure out what power, bandwidth, and frequency assignments to allocate so that we result in the best organization of the band. Today, in areas where there's a lot of congestion, there's a lot of use, we have to do this in a little bit more of a manual way, but over the course of this year, as I said, this will become fully automated. So another really exciting innovation that's going to be coming over the course of this year. Next slide, please. So why Federated? As I said, we are a leader in the space. We really helped create the ecosystem, have been working closely with the FCC, even in instantiating the FCC's rules for the CBRS band. And we've been thrilled to work with over 100 customers now that are connected to our platform. What really differentiates us is we really meet you at your business in terms of how we support you. As I said, we take a telco mentality in terms of the 5 nines availability for our SaaS, the investments that we've made in our ESC, but we really have world-class customer support to help you with whatever needs that you have to get you up and running quickly, to make sure that we're able to troubleshoot any issues that you have. Operating in the CBRS band, we want to make sure that you're, positioned to be, completely successful, and our support teams are in place to, to help make that a reality. We've won a bunch of awards. We're thrilled to be recognized in the industry for the work that we've done, and we'd love to, work with all of you. Next slide, please. So a little bit more in terms of where you can find out, resources around CPI training, around migration plans or guides if you're a Part 90 user, our customer support portal, and just general information for anyone who's looking to do a fixed wireless or a wireless ISP deployment. Mary, back to you.
Thanks, Kurt. So we have a little bit of time right now before we move on to the next portion. Anyone that has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we can answer them for you right now. We have a question here from Joel. How can we find out about spectrum cost scales?
Sure. So as I said in that 2-tier sharing framework, the priority access licenses, those licenses were issued through the FCC auction. And there will be what we believe will be secondary market transactions. So there will be opportunities for anyone who's interested in a priority access license to be able to lease that spectrum from the primary licensee. We're actually creating a marketplace that will help facilitate those transactions. In the GAA tier, there's no cost for the spectrum. You don't actually have to pay for the spectrum. There's no license required. What is required is the ongoing spectrum management service. You have to connect to a spectrum access system like what Federated provides. And as part of that, we charge a monthly fee to help facilitate all of the work that we need to do or cover, to provide that service to you. So anyone who's interested in finding out more can, contact me directly. We'd be happy to, get someone from our sales team engaged so that we can, give you a better sense of what those spectrum access services cost. But, suffice it to say it is a very low operational cost in terms of the, the overall context of the, the network operation.
Thank you, Kurt. We have another question from Stephen. Whose RF tool is being used, and what is the resolution of the geo data, such as terrain and clutter?
Sure. Yeah. So we make the tool available. So it's branded as a a Federated Wireless capability, and it's I don't know the geo data resolution off the top of my head. I think we can go all the way down even to 1 meter, but we have had quite a bit of success with customers who have used this for, as I said, modeling CPE installs, and being able to do very accurate predictions of, on either sides of a house, because it can use, clutter data and other, import other databases in order to, perform that modeling. So we'd be happy, if you want to learn more about that, again, please contact me. We'd be happy to set up a demo.
And one last question for now, from Katie, how do we handle interference from other users?
Yeah, so I briefly touched on that. It is probably a topic that might be deserving of a webinar all of it in its own. But the basic concept is something that we call coexistence. And what we do is we model every single base station or every single access point that is deployed. Since, as I described, each access point has to register with our system and provide that CPI record, so we know its location, we know the height, we know what other RF parameters are associated with that site, like its antenna characteristics. We're able to develop a very accurate RF model of everyone who is deployed, your network as well as the networks operated by others in the local area. And through that, we use some sophisticated algorithms that identify where the coverage overlaps occur. And we're then able to, through this process of identifying what networks overlap or don't overlap, be able to identify what spectrum assignments we need to make in order to make sure users don't interfere with each other. Today, that's a semi-automated approach. We do this through help of our customer support team. And later this year, we will offer that capability in a fully automated way.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Just to keep this moving, I'll pass it over to Juan now, and he'll take you through the base station and CPE portion of the webinar.
Great. Thank you, Mari. Thank you, Kurt. We can go directly to the next slide, and so let's talk about a bit about BLiNQ networks. So BLiNQ itself is pioneered manufacturing CBRS certified fixed wireless access equipment. We are mainly working with LTE NodeBs and their counterparts, their CPEs. Our solutions, they've been designed for the fixed wireless access market, but they can also be implemented quite easily with a mobility environment. One key aspect from our design perspective is that these products have been designed with a simplicity point of view. At least that's been the attempt here, just to make it fit on any type of installation. So you have a really compact type of equipment that could be installed from a pole to a wall or whatever is needed, which conversely provide some versatility for the end user, the operator, on any type of projects, whether that is expanding to a remote community or perhaps densifying a network on an urban busy intersection. So our products, our LTE NodeBs, in this case, the FW300i, represents the counterpart to the SAS. As Kurt was explaining, the CBRS ecosystem mainly consists of these two portions. One is a spectrum controller represented by Federated here, and the other one is a CBSD, which is the radio, whether it is an access point or a CPE, that is connecting back to the SAS in order to get an authorization to transmit, and then SAS takes care of the spectrum sharing processes that Kurt described. We can go to the next slide, Mari, please. So our FW300i specifically, it's an LTE NodeB within the CBRS ecosystem for access point. Yes, there are two different area interfaces that have been defined. One is Ultra, which is LTE, and the other one is another proprietary area interface from other vendors. In the case of BLiNQ, we're working on LTE, and which means that for the CBRS ecosystem, that is band 48, as highlighted here to the left. And the product itself, it is, as shown previously as well, it is an integrated solution. So we have an integrated antennas with antenna gain of 17 dBi, and the whole RF change has been designed to map or to meet the max allowed ERP within the CBRS ecosystems per the regulations and the standards. One kind of unique aspect to our eNodeB here is that we can do what we've defined as software-defined carrier steering, which is trying to be, described here on this animation to the right, which is the ability to have our carriers or cells or sectors, however you want to look at them. We can steer them dynamically through software and change their pointing. This is also relevant for the CBRS ecosystem because each of these carriers or radios, it is a CBSD. So when we do this, we are effectively changing the installation parameters of these radios, and consequently, they also need to go SAS and seek for a new registration and subsequently an authorization from them. From an antenna perspective, the F300i is doing a 2x2 MIMO, and we're currently sitting on release 13 of the 3GPP releases for the LTE network. Mari, we can move over to the next slide and talk a bit about our CPE. So the CPE is another element within the CBRS ecosystem. So the CPE is evidently the device that we use to install at the customer premises, which connects to the access point. But they both, and by both I mean the CPE and the Inode B, they both reach out to SAS in order to get an authorization to transmit and be compliant, be compliant within the CBRS space. So there are some RF characteristics for this particular CPE. Again, this is perhaps it's one release back on the 3GPP releases, it's release 12, but again, it has all the capabilities that are pretty much the cutting edge within the LTE network deployments. Now, the kind of the unique aspect or addition to this device here, or main addition, is that unlike other approaches for this solution, we have taken the path of using or developing a CBSD agent for the CPE. So again, just to underline, like within CBRS, we have these two elements. One is the SAS or spectrum controller, and the other one is the CBSD. So the CBSD, these are the devices that are connecting to that. Normally, or not normally, but another solution that we have often seen in the field is that some CPEs are using some kind of domain proxy to reach out to SAS. In our case, we have gone down the path of using a CBSD agent. And so what I'd like to do now, and if we go now to the next slide, I'd like to take this our audience and show them really quick. I'll give you 1 second here. Yep. Okay, so the whole idea, this is the FW300i web UI interface. So as explained on the previous slide, this device, it actually has 3 different sectors of Inode Bs. So from a CBSD or CBRS standpoint, each of these devices are independent to each other. So each CBSD needs to be authorized by SAS in order to enable transmissions. So from our configuration standpoint, we do show in our dashboard independently how this CBSD get authorized or granted or registered or whatever. So when initially powered up or initially configured to reach out to the SAS, what the software does is that it goes from unregistered state to then registered, then granted, and finally authorized. So the authorized state means that they've been stamped, as okay to transmit by the SAS, and they've been assigned a particular TX power and frequency which they can use. So this is this is actually showing or displaying the responses that the CBSD, or in our case, our software, has received from the SAS after these spectrum inquiry or spectrum request process. Now, within our software, we do have a separate tab or page here to go over the configuration of the CBSD. Now, as Kurt was explaining, the CBSD, it actually needs to be, in a way, CPI signed. So the CPI is a certified professional installer that it is responsible for the, let's say, the installation parameters that the SAS or the software controller has on this particular CBSD. So when Federated is doing their calculation on how is a particular CBSD transmitting in terms of azimuth, heading, power, frequency, and whatnot, it is definitely relying on the information that the CPI has provided. So that information gets into the SAS in one of two ways. So the CBSD can be configured to be set or to be registered on a single step process or a multi-step. When we do multi-step, what we do from the CBSD end, it is that we simply take note of these device parameters, which are the SSC IDs, CBSD ID, so on and so forth. And then these are installed on the Spectrum Controller portal and with certain installation parameters. When doing that, then Federated knows what is the user ID and the CPI ID of the person that is making this installation. So in a way, they are controlling who is liable for making this installation. Now, the other way to do that is we simply don't have to always go to the Spectrum Controller portal to create these CBSDs there, and then we can choose to do a single-step registration process from the CBSD end. However, to do this, it is the same process. The only difference is that we are not doing it at the SAS portal. We have to do it from the CBSD end. We generate a form that includes the installation parameters for the CBSDs, meaning what we mean by installation parameters. These are the locations, the headings, height, so on and so forth. And then that package gets created and communicated by the CBSD to the SAS, and we get into that authorization state eventually. On the FW300i, not only we do have 3 cells or 3 CBSDs that somehow we need to register or install in the portal, but also we have the flexibility of going through a full spectrum request process. What this means is that when the CBSD is asking SAS for the channels that it may have available, we can also ask him to respond to a spectrum inquiry request message that simply has all those channels that SAS has available for that particular user ID and that CBSD. And again, then there is an internal algorithm within our system that selects the best channel available considering the noise level from that particular location. So in a way, we are also working from this end to try to avoid high noise levels and self-interference and whatnot. So these are some added functionalities, and these particular two, persistent grant and multi-grant, are in a way proprietary features from our end. The first one, the persistent grant, means that if for some reason the CBSD or the E0B, or to put it more precise, or the FW300i gets rebooted or it is power cycled by any reason, instead of going through a deregistration process and a grant relinquishment to the SAS, it is preserving its current configuration in order to, when it reboots back and when it's powered on back, it will reconnect to the SAS, and instead of going through that spectrum request process, it will simply reactivate its current grant and begin transmitting. Then we have also incorporated from our end multi-grant functionality, which allows each CBSD or each sector for that matter to have kind of a backup grant And well, the reason we've incorporated that in the latest release stems from many instances where we have seen DP8 activations, and that could be part of another conversation. But essentially, is that the CBSD they get suspended in occasions due to incumbent activities, and they simply stop transmitting. But with this functionality, we have, let's say, another grant to fall back and continue operation. So I won't spend much more time on this one because I like to keep some time for a few questions at the end. And also, I like to go over a brief overview of the CPE as well, just because, as I mentioned, on the CPE or the CAT12 devices, we have also built a CBSD agent. So within the CBRS tab of our devices, we have essentially 3 different menus. One that is pretty much informative for the end user to know what is the state of the current CBSD within the CPE. In this case, as mentioned before, we set this up prior to this webinar. So these particular CPEs are already registered and authorized. However, within the basic tab, it's about going through the same process as I shown on the FW300i. I mean, ultimately we have the same developers, so we can either do multi-step or single-step and go through the same process. The main difference when compared to the FW300i, it is that not only the FCC ID here is different, but when installing this CBSD within the SAS portal, it's just one CBSD, so there's just one radio on the CPE. So it is far more intuitive from that perspective. The CPE also incorporates some other troubleshooting functionalities for the CBSD control. Like if, for instance, at some point in time, an operator needs to either restart the CBSD or simply deregister or relinquish a grant, this can be done through all these things. So, Maddie, we can go back to you. Let me stop sharing my screen. Yep. And yeah, so the idea is, or the idea was to provide a quicker review of our hardware and simply highlight that within the CBRS environment, we have these 2 elements. One is the SAS that essentially controls all the spectrum access and allocation. And the other one is a CBSD that is the device actually requesting for this spectrum. And that is represented in one of 2 forms. You either have it on an access point or on a CPE. So in our case, we've gone with, like I said, with the approach of having it in both. And yeah, it's something that seems to be working well for us so far. So we could answer any questions that our audience may have from now on. Maddie?
Yeah, so yeah, we've opened up the floor now for Q&A. Feel free to type in your questions for Juan and Kurt, and we'll be here to answer them till 3 o'clock. So feel free to shoot over your questions. And feel free to mention anything else you want to add, Juan or Kurt, at this point. You might have had some thoughts during the presentation that you wanted to add.
I might just, Mary, make a quick comment about the certified professional installer training.
Yes.
And just I'll mention for the benefit of everyone, The training program actually contains quite a bit of content about CBRS, about some of the operational practices. It's not just content that would be useful for an installer or someone who's doing the data entry to take. You know, quite honestly, anyone who's interested in learning more about CBRS and doing a much deeper dive would benefit a lot from that training course. And we do offer a version of that course where you don't have to take the exam if you don't want to get certified. So that's an option too.
Great, thank you, Kurt. I think we have a couple of questions that just came in. Do all SAS operators share CBSD registrations for allocation?
Yes, we do. So in fact, on a daily basis, we go through a process of exchanging or peering with the other spectrum access system administrators with their systems and exchange the relevant information that is necessary so that each of us can do a complete modeling of the RF environment as I described. When we do share data, customer information and you know, other particulars are held confidential. So we obscure that information so that your data isn't going to, you know, about who you are isn't going outside of, say, the confines of Federated. But we do share the basic information about locations and other technical data so that we can, you know, do all the interference calculations and spectrum management functions that we need to.
Thanks. One came in from Barry. If you are granted about 40 megahertz of GAA spectrum for a CBSD, would there possibly become a time down the road where the SAS may take away a portion of this 40 megahertz of spectrum bandwidth when other GAA users request bandwidth in the same area?
Yeah, so we, the nature of GAA is that it's not a guarantee on bandwidth. So that question is accurate in its sense that if there's a lot of contention for spectrum, a lot of demand for spectrum in a given area, and in order for us to satisfy all requests, we may not be able to satisfy the amount asked for. We may have to allocate something less to meet demand. That is a possibility. And that's where sometimes leasing a priority access license or entering into some other arrangements like a shared network may alleviate some concerns around how much GAA spectrum would be available. But I would remind folks that 150 megahertz of spectrum is quite a lot. I mean, even if you're allocated somewhere between 20 to 40 megahertz in a given location, you can do quite a lot with that over 4G or 5G. So we have quite a bit of supply to meet demand, which I think is sort of a good starting point for us as we think about what happens as deployment intensifies in the band.
And a question from Mark: when replacing the CPE, is it better to deregister and or relinquish the CBSD or to delete it from the SAS?
So if it's a bit complex. If you're replacing a CPE within the same location, initially it wouldn't matter because each CPE has its own CBSD ID. So it will be a new registration on the SAS. Now, the old register is going to remain there. And if at some point in time you decide to install that old CPE somewhere else, then you would have a conflict. So if it's a situation where the CPE died and you have certainty that it won't be installed anywhere else, you don't have to worry like right off the bat. But if you're looking to reinstall it somewhere else, yes, it will be wise to remove it from the Spectrum Controller portal.
Thanks, Juan. Any other questions? I just want to remind everyone that there's a special with Federated, $100 off the CPI training for March and April. The code is BLiNQ 2021. I'll be following up with an email with all the resources and links, including this this special offer. So just wait for that email tomorrow. Okay. I think we can wrap up here. Thank you to Kurt and Juan for presenting and for sharing your knowledge today. To everyone who attended, thank you for your time and for joining us. As I mentioned, I'll follow up with an email tomorrow with a recording of this webinar, and you'll be able to access links and other resources from today's webinar from that email. So thank you again, and we look forward to having you join us again next time.
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks so much, Mary. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.